South America produced in less than 50 years two of the most brilliant generals in its history. One of them crossed the Andes with an army entirely stripped of resources. He liberated 3 countries, and today he is rightfully proclaimed a continental hero. The other, well, he stopped the most powerful army in the Americas, and he did it with fewer men, fewer weapons, and considerably less time.
And here is where it gets really interesting. One of these men is known in absolutely every corner of the Spanish-speaking world. You literally cannot study history without hearing his name. The other, he's barely known outside of his own country. Today, in this explainer, we are going to dive deep into uncovering the uncomfortable truth as to exactly why that is.
Right, so to really understand what these two generals actually shared, we've broken it down into a clear roadmap. First, we will set the context on who San Martín is. Second, we will look at Principle 1, military intelligence. Third, we explore Principle 2, strategic flanking. After that, we'll cover their institutional innovation. And finally, we will tackle that uncomfortable question.
Okay, let's start with Part 1. Context. Who is San Martín, the consensus greatest strategist?
By vast historical consensus, José de San Martín is the absolute greatest military strategist South America produced in the entire 19th century. Just look at his undeniable credentials. In 1817, he executed one of the most audacious operations in continental history. He crossed the Andes Mountains. And he didn't just cross them, he did this in the dead of winter. Think about what that actually means. We are talking about leading a massive force of nearly 5,000 men, plus hauling heavy, cumbersome artillery over freezing mountain peaks that reach upwards of 4,000 meters high. It's almost unimaginable to modern sensibilities. That operation alone guarantees a permanent place in the history books. But he didn't stop there. He arrived in Chile and then completely defeated the realist army at the Battle of Chacabuco in less than 45 minutes of actual combat. Just 45 minutes. That victory kicked off a massive campaign that would eventually begin the liberation of Argentina, Chile, and Peru.
That is just an astonishing logistical feat. I mean, what exactly did San Martín do to achieve all of this with such incredibly limited resources?
It really comes down to 2 highly specific tactical principles. And what is truly fascinating here, the whole point of our deep dive today, is that when we look closely, we see that José Eduvigis Díaz, operating over in the swamps of Paraguay, applied those exact same 2 principles. So let's move to Principle 1, military intelligence, what we call the invisible weapon.
You see, San Martín did not cross the Andes blindly. Not at all. Before moving a single soldier, he spent months, literally months, building one of the most highly sophisticated intelligence networks seen in colonial America. By using spies infiltrated deep within Chile, San Martín knew exactly where the realist forces were. He knew their supply lines, he knew their weak points, and most crucially, he knew exactly what their commanders believed he was going to do. He deliberately fed the realists a completely false route, the Los Patos crossing. So while the enemy scrambled and prepared for an attack at Los Patos, he executed the real crossing in secret at Uspallata. By the time the realists realized what was actually happening, the army of the Andes was already firmly in Chilean territory.
That level of deception is just brilliant. So how did Díaz apply that exact same principle over in Paraguay?
Well, Díaz operated with an equivalent level of sophistication, but he perfectly adapted it to his specific environment. Instead of mountains, he had the swamps, the mud, and the dense jungle of Paraguay, and they served as his natural intelligence network. The Paraguayan soldiers knew absolutely every single hidden trail and every obscure river crossing, routes that would take the Allied forces weeks to even discover. But Díaz actually took it a step further. At Curupayty, he completely hid his defensive preparations for weeks. He essentially let the advancing Allies build up a mental image of the Paraguayan defense that was deliberately, meticulously incomplete. So when they finally launched their attack, they slammed into a reality that was drastically, violently different from what they expected. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is this. Both of these generals fundamentally made their enemies fight against a completely false version of their real position.
Which brings us to Principle 2, strategic flanking, a force multiplier. Now, flanking is an ancient tactic, of course, but San Martín turned it into an absolute science. Just look at how he applied it at Chacabuco. Instead of launching a direct, brute force frontal assault against a much stronger, better positioned enemy, he divided his force into 2 separate columns. He fixed the enemy at the front, basically creating this powerful illusion of a massive direct attack. Meanwhile, his second column flanked unexpectedly from the left, appearing exactly where the enemy simply didn't anticipate them. And the result? The entire realist formation collapsed in under an hour.
Why? Simply because no army, no matter how strong, can fight effectively in two opposing directions simultaneously.
Okay, so San Martin clearly used flanking as a massive offensive force multiplier. But how did Díaz utilize this if he was primarily playing defense?
This is where it gets incredibly clever. If San Martin used flanking to attack, Díaz reverse-engineered the entire concept to defend. At Curupayty, Díaz built what we call an architectural flanking system. His trenches were not just a simple straight line. Instead, they were complex, angled configurations specifically designed to create overlapping fields of lateral fire. Because of this brilliant architecture, any Allied troops advancing straight forward into the front automatically expose themselves to devastating crossfire from the flanks of those angled trenches. It's a fatal geometry. Think about that for a second. The enemy essentially flanked themselves simply by moving forward. San Martin would have recognized this brilliance immediately. You never, ever let the enemy fight under the conditions they chose.
Which leads us to Section 4, Institutional Innovation, creating armies from nothing. Because, those tactical similarities on the battlefield are undeniable and fascinating, but what about their leadership off the battlefield? It feels like history so often minimizes the uncinematic, gritty task of actually building that military capacity in the first place.
Exactly. It's so crucial to look at their institutional leadership, especially under severe scarcity. When San Martin arrived in Mendoza back in 1814, there was absolutely no army waiting for him. He had to build the whole thing from scratch. He organized the complex logistics, sourced the equipment, and crucially built up the morale of men who had mostly never fought a military campaign of that scale. And he managed to do all of this in just 2 years, dealing with highly irregular, often non-existent support from Buenos Aires. It's an incredible administrative achievement. Díaz, meanwhile, was operating under arguably even more extreme conditions. As the war progressed, Paraguay was suffering completely irrecoverable manpower losses. The Allied forces could replace their casualties, Paraguay simply could not. So Díaz had to constantly, relentlessly adapt his tactics just to survive. When he lacked artillery, he leaned heavily on the terrain. When he was lacking men, he maximized defensive positioning. And when he was lacking time, he used sheer speed. That right there is the pure essence of institutional leadership, taking a broken system and making it function anyway.
And that brings us to Section 5, the uncomfortable question: why is one forgotten?
This is something we really have to ask. If their methods were so incredibly parallel, if they were both utilizing these genius principles, why does San Martin have statues across continents? You find them in Buenos Aires, Lima, Santiago, and Madrid, and his campaigns are studied in military academies globally. Meanwhile, Díaz is virtually unknown outside of Paraguay. Why is one a global hero, while the other is practically forgotten?
It really is a harsh reality to face, but it comes down to 3 deeply ingrained historical reasons. First, simply put, San Martin won his war. Díaz won his battles, yes, but he did so within a broader war that Paraguay ultimately lost, and history overwhelmingly remembers the victors. It writes the books based on who won, not necessarily who was the most brilliant tactician on the ground. Second, nations naturally celebrate their independence. San Martin fought for a narrative that multiple modern nations still have huge political incentives to preserve and celebrate. Díaz, on the other hand, fought in a war where the victorious allies, Argentina, Brazil, Uruguay, have absolutely zero political interest in glorifying the strategic ingenuity of the Paraguayan side. And third, tragically, Paraguay was left physically and historiographically devastated by the conflict. The population was utterly destroyed, which meant there was literally almost no one left with the resources, the political capital, or the voice to tell Díaz's incredible story to the rest of the world.
Now, acknowledging all of this doesn't pass any sort of negative judgment on San Martin. Let's be clear, his greatness is completely indisputable. But when we put both of these men under the exact same analytical criteria, the conclusion is undeniably clear. South America produced, in the span of just 50 years, 2 world-class military minds. One was globally recognized and the other wasn't. Recognizing Díaz does not diminish San Martin in the slightest. Rather, it simply completes the picture of South American military genius.
So, despite everything, the swamps, the mud, and the suffocating heat of Paraguay produced a true tactical genius. Is it finally time the world knew about him?
Without a doubt, absolutely.
In our next explainer, we are crossing the Atlantic to look at Díaz versus Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, the Spanish great captain. But we leave you with this. Today's comment question: if San Martin had commanded the Paraguayan defense at Curupayty, would he have achieved the same results as Díaz? Leave your vote below and subscribe to the channel.